Is a fair trial psychologically impossible? Imagine you've committed a crime, and before your trial, you were given a choice of two judges, perfectly identical in experience, knowledge, and moral compass, but with one single difference: what they had for breakfast. Judge A had delicious streaky bacon and eggs, whereas Judge B had cold porridge and burnt toast. I think I speak for most people when I say I would much rather have Judge A. Now, in a fair judicial system, you would hope judges made decisions based solely on the evidence presented and the existing legislation in place. This would mean that if a case was repeated 100 times, no matter what the defendant looked like or the time of day, the result would be the same as the evidence remains unchanged. This would mean that if this was the case, surely you would have no preference at all to which judge you received. But this preference does exist, and rightly so, because in reality, there are a multitude of variables and cognitive biases that can extraneously affect the results of your trial, even something as trivial as what the judge had for breakfast. The common caricature that justice is what the judge ate for breakfast was tested in a 2011 study of 8 Jewish Israeli judges presiding over 2 different parole boards serving 4 major prisons in Israel. Each judge took 2 daily food breaks, dividing the day into 3 distinct sessions, with the data from 1,112 trials over 50 complete days being recorded. The likelihood of a ruling in favour of a prisoner peaked at approximately 65% at the beginning of each session, before steadily declining to near 0, and then jumping back up to 65 after a break for a meal. This evidence suggests that when judges make repeated rulings, they show an increased tendency to rule in favour of the status quo, which can be overcome by taking a break to eat a meal. In short, you have significantly better odds if your trial is right after lunch than just before. But even with an alert and well-fed judge, your outcome is still heavily influenced by biases in the jury. Jurors are expected to hear and evaluate legal evidence in a rational and impartial manner to reach a joint verdict, allowing the defendant a fair trial. But, as psychological research has shown, this is not the case. Jurors, like all humans, can be biased and illogical in their decision-making, despite their legal significance. Now, you might think having a multiple-person jury would mean individual pre-trial biases towards factors such as race, gender, and age would be averaged out. But, for this to reasonably occur, many assumptions and conditions would need to be met. Several biases would need to be equally spread out and counterbalanced within the jury. For example, if a bias that young people are more likely to commit a crime is present in the jury, there must also be a bias present that old people are more likely to offend. The probability of all these conditions being met is highly unlikely, and proxy research into jury decision-making also supports the verdict that the intended averaging does not occur. In fact, it may be psychologically impossible to choose a selection of 12 people in which all existing biases are evenly counterbalanced, as many of these biases would be unconscious and impossible to empirically test. We can attempt to minimize this problem by ensuring a heterogeneous jury consisting of multiple backgrounds, demographics, and political and societal beliefs and ideologies. Juror personality traits could also be taken into account, as high levels of juror extroversion on the Big 5 personality test have been previously associated with not guilty verdicts. Jurors are also prone to cognitive biases and applications of mental shortcuts, known as heuristics, which can cause errors in logical decision-making. In a trial, jurors are presented with massive amounts of evidence and complex information, which can be particularly difficult to process depending on the juror's pre-existing understanding of the judicial system. To cope with this large cognitive load, the brain relies largely on heuristics to increase efficiency. However, this means information requiring deep mental processing can be disregarded or only part absorbed, allowing simpler information and surface-level impressions, like the defendant's demeanour or physical appearance, to unfairly sway decisions. Confirmation bias is also exceedingly common in jurors in the form of pre-decisional distortion, which has been defined as jurors' biased interpretation of new evidence to support whichever verdict is tentatively favoured as a trial progresses. Jurors tend to favour a verdict before all the evidence has been presented, and this pre-decisional preference distorts the interpretation of the remaining evidence to support the already mentally leading verdict. The rise of pre-trial publicity due to social media has also heavily contributed to pre-decisional distortion, as jurors who have had negative publicity on the defendant are much more likely to produce a guilty verdict, regardless of the evidence presented. Cognitive biases, in general, tend to have much more influence when the situation or information is ambiguous, like a grey area being easy to distort to either black or white. Jury trials are inherently ambiguous, as police investigations with strong evidence are likely to lead to confessions of guilt, whereas police investigations with weak evidence are likely to never reach the courtroom at all. The adversarial system also leads to trials being ambiguous, with two opposing sides competing to convince jurors that their version of events is closer to the truth than the other side's. Meaning, the concept of the trials themselves are highly facilitating to mental bias and thus prevent the possibility of a truly fair trial. Ultimately, the justice system relies on the ability of humans, who are famously subjective and cognitively biased, to make just and objective decisions. Every trial will inevitably have a multitude of psychological variables affecting its outcome, which may prevent it from ever being truly fair. But the way forward is not to pretend these variables do not exist, but rather to find better ways to minimize their influence, so that justice relies a little less on cold burnt breakfast and a lot more on cold hard facts. Thank you.